Third chapter of the Shadow manga's out. Let's talk about it. First, I want to talk about a few things outside the story. I made a mistake in the last video. I called the series a tie-in when in fact it does state itself to be an adaptation. That might seem like a minor difference because tons of media ends up using those terms interchangeably even though they shouldn't be, but that does actually alter the core framing of how I should be looking at the material. While I definitely can and will be using the manga to enhance my experience of the source material, I should be primarily viewing it as its own separate take on the story. So more like how I view Archie's Adventure 1 arc instead of their single-issue Adventure 2 adaptation. It being an adaptation also does dampen my hopes a bit that it could become an ongoing, but hopefully it continues to sell well. So as before, ways to buy the book yourself in the description. But this also means, with the game being out, we can actually fairly compare and contrast what is being done with the material. Second thing I want to talk about is some stuff Amada tweeted. I know in the lead up to this manga, everyone was worried it would be very comedy heavy, which of course it didn't end up being, but Amada actually tweeted what he would have pitched had it been a comedy manga. Those two stories being Shadow with smooth hair during shedding season, which I assume would be referring to his chest fur making him look more like Sonic, and Shadow having to dye his fur blue to stand in for Sonic for a day. I really like both those ideas, especially the second one, and while I love what we've gotten so far, I am gonna mourn the fact that we'll never see that come to print. Amada also posts some art every once in a while and drew a really cool piece of Rouge, though he did state that this piece isn't manga related. Being that this story is currently setting itself between the events on board the ARK and Sonic Adventure 2's core story, I somehow doubt we'll see her. But really, who knows? With those two things out of the way, let's talk about this chapter. Spoilers ahead, of course. As you'd expect from the previous chapters, the art continues to be impressive. I always love Amada's artwork. The story picks up right where the last one left off, with Shadow and his little bug-eyed acquaintance in the white space version of the ARK. Probably the closest thing that I'll get to making a complaint in this, Bug-Eye says that this arc is not exactly the same as the real one, which I don't really feel we get to see. The first chapter gave more of a solid feeling of how the arc was, but in terms of establishing shots here, we really only get this hallway. No getting warped into Radical Highway in this chapter. The two are ambushed by gun robots, with Shadow narrowly saving his dubious ally from destruction, before easily breaking apart their attackers, shocking the little creature. Maybe the robots are what's different about the ARK, cause while we know they were present on the ARK from the games, they didn't really show up in the earlier chapters. I went back and checked. From here, Shadow is finally shown the first of these so-called wish orbs, and it's the power sealing devices from the game. Based on the game, the fact the energy goes into Shadow the exact same way, and the menacing face Bug-Eye pulls after, makes me pretty certain Shadow's being lied to. I'm even kind of assuming that Bug-Eye will just turn out to be Black Doom or some equivalent of him in disguise. The funny thing is that Shadow is even wondering if he's being deceived later on in this chapter, so I fully expect a gag in a future installment where Doom reveals himself, and Shadow says he's already figured everything out. The pacing is also making me worry that we don't have too much longer in this manga. There's only 3 wish orbs and he has one already. There are 6 stages in the game currently, each with 2 acts, so we're already splitting that in half. If it continues to be paced this way, there's a decent possibility that this will only last 3 more chapters. 2 to get the last remaining orbs, and 1 to wrap up the story. Hoping that isn't the case, or at least that Amada gets to work on another Sonic project soon after. Once Shadow absorbs the orb, Bug-Eye tells him the only way to return to White Space is to defeat the master of this world, which turns out to be the Bio Lizard. These are both changes from how things are presented in the game, as the sealing devices are in the overworld, while the bosses are separate from the stages and need to be unlocked with keys. I think this change is fine. The mechanics of this work in the game, but it's cleaner narratively and makes more sense for the change in medium for them to be a part of the stage. The fight scene is great, and we get a pretty raw moment of Shadow tanking a direct hit from the Bio Lizard in order to gain enough energy to properly put away his foe. Something funny I did notice is that during this fight, Shadow's characterization leans closer to Ian Flynn's take on how he would treat the Bio Lizard. There was actually some discourse about this. In the English language version of the game, Shadow regards the creature with pity, wanting to end its suffering. In the Japanese language version, he speaks to it rather tersely, not really viewing it as any more than an obstacle. This was exacerbated when Izuka said in an interview that Shadow doesn't really have any sympathy for the bio-lizard. Here though, Amada's take is more similar to Ian's, with his line even being pretty similar. So it is firmly split on whether or not Shadow would feel bad for this thing. From my point of view, the bio-lizard being an abject aberration, kept alive more or less against its will, I can't imagine many characters not feeling bad for it. And with it essentially being Shadow's early draft, I think he can have some nuanced feelings about it. Maybe both things are true in some way. Maybe he looks at it and doesn't feel any kinship with it or any existential horror that it could have been him. But despite that, he might still look at it and understand its existence is pitiful. Both is good. After defeating the bio-lizard, he runs into Maria again, but now she can both hear him and speak. However, for some reason, she still can't see him or feel him, strengthening Shadow's resolve to continue on his quest. But we also learn that this is not the Maria who got shot, but one from slightly earlier in the timeline, meaning she probably has no clue as to what is going to happen to her. So, my thoughts. I think this manga continues to be really solid, despite its great departures from the source material. Stuff like that never stopped me from liking Fleetway or Archie. It's not gonna stop me here. Again, really hoping this will continue past the game story and get an official publication in the US. And if not, hopefully it'll get a spotlight on more of Amada's work. Still really hoping someone goes back and translates his one-shot, The Vampire Lord and the Steel Girl, because I like it conceptually so much. A fun thought I've had is maybe them getting him to do a story for next year's IDW Sonic Annual, but I don't know what the logistics of doing something like that would be. I do just want more people to see his art. Thank you so much for watching. I am so behind on videos. My plan was to get something out last week, but due to a combination of life stuff happening, and that script being 11 pages long, it's taking me a little bit of time. And I thank you all for your patience. I'm still trying to get 2 more videos out this month, because I already have things planned for December and January, and if I don't get them both out now, one of them is gonna get pretty delayed. If you like my content and want to support me, you can hit like, subscribe, leave a comment letting me know how I did, or support me over on Patreon. And a special shout out to my $5 patrons, Ned Rex, Nate DM990, Diddly Do, and Queer Kaiju. See y'all in the next video.